There are certain lives in history that unfold not like a stately, well-rehearsed symphony, but like a piece of improvisational music. They begin with a melody full of light and promise, a theme that suggests a future of harmony and grace. But then, a dissonant chord is struck, a note of unexpected tragedy, a political mandate, a denial of the heart. The entire composition shifts. The music becomes haunted by that initial point of pain, and every subsequent movement, every choice, every soaring crescendo and quiet diminuendo is an attempt to either resolve that discord or escape from its lingering echo. These are the stories that tell us the most about the human condition, because they reveal how a single defining moment of loss can shape the entire trajectory of a soul, twisting a life of privilege into a private prison of regret. Today we explore one of the most poignant and cautionary of these lives. It is the story of a princess born into the very heart of imperial power, a woman who stood at the nexus of the two most powerful dynasties in the world, those of Great Britain and Germany. Her life was meant to be a bridge between two cultures, a testament to a future of liberal hope and gentle duty. But that future was never allowed to arrive. Instead, her heart was broken by decree, sacrificed on the cold altar of European power politics. This is the astonishing, heartbreaking, and deeply human story of Princess Viktoria of Prussia, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, whose vivacious spirit was systematically crushed, and whose final desperate grasp for happiness became her ultimate undoing. Join us as we unravel the life of the princess who was denied her first love and who paid the price for it until her very last breath. To truly understand the tragedy of Viktoria of Prussia, one must first step into the unique and politically charged world she was born into. Friederike Amalia Wilhelmina Victoria was born on April 12, 1866, at the New Palace in Potsdam, a sprawling Baroque masterpiece that symbolized the power and grandeur of the Prussian monarchy. By birthright, she was at the absolute pinnacle of European society. Her paternal grandfather was Wilhelm I, the King of Prussia, and from 1871, the first German emperor, a man who embodied the stern, militaristic, and deeply conservative values of the old Prussian Junker aristocracy. He was a monarch of the old school, a man who believed in the divine right of kings and the absolute supremacy of the army in the affairs of the state. Her destiny seemed inextricably linked to the glory of the new, triumphant German Reich, forged in the fires of military victory against Denmark, Austria, and France. Yet the home in which Victoria was raised was a world away from the rigid, heel-clicking atmosphere of her grandfather's court. It was an island of English liberalism, intellectual curiosity, and artistic sensibility, meticulously cultivated by her extraordinary parents. Her father was Crown Prince Friedrich, known in the family as Fritz. He was a man of immense decency and liberal sympathies, a decorated war hero who nonetheless dreamed of steering the new Germany away from the path of militarism. Having witnessed the horrors of the battlefield firsthand, he was repulsed by the glorification of war that so animated his peers. He envisioned a constitutional monarchy modeled on that of Great Britain, a nation governed by a parliament dedicated to peace and fostering the arts and sciences. This dream was passionately shared and in many ways driven by his wife Victoria, the Princess Royal of Great Britain, Queen Victoria's eldest and most intellectually brilliant child. Known as Vicky, the Crown Princess was a force of nature, fiercely intelligent, passionately liberal, and artistically gifted. She had been sent to Germany as a teenager to marry Fritz, and as she and her father, Prince Albert, had hoped, to help liberalize her adopted homeland. She arrived with crates of books by John Stuart Mill and Walter Bagehot, her mind alight with the principles of constitutional government and individual liberty. From the moment she arrived, however, she was met with suspicion and hostility by the deeply conservative Berlin court. To them, she was always the Englishwoman, a foreign interloper trying to corrupt the pure martial spirit of Prussia with her strange democratic ideas. Her chief antagonist was the colossal figure of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the political architect of German unification. Bismarck despised everything Vicky stood for. He saw her liberalism as a direct threat to the authoritarian, monarchical system he had painstakingly built, and he did everything in his power to isolate her and undermine her influence. He mocked her intellectual pursuits, intercepted her mail, and spread malicious rumors that she was a British spy working against the interests of the Reich. It was within this domestic fortress, this loving sanctuary besieged by a hostile court, that Princess Viktoria grew up. The Crown Prince's palace was not just a home, it was a counter-court, a statement of intent. Its rooms were filled not with military portraits, but with contemporary art Vicky had commissioned. Its library was stocked with the works of progressive thinkers from across Europe. The dinner guests were not just aristocrats and generals, but also scientists, philosophers, and artists like the painter Anton von Werner. This was the environment that shaped the young princess. She was the second of three daughters, nicknamed Moretta by her family due to her dark hair and complexion, which contrasted with the fairer looks of her siblings. She was a delightful child, inheriting her mother's charm and energy and her father's kind and gentle temperament. She was far more approachable and good-natured than her mercurial and often difficult elder sister Charlotte, who seemed to thrive on the intrigue of the Berlin court and would later become a thorn in her mother's side. Viktoria was also less serious than her younger sister Sophie, who was studious and pious. Moretta was the darling of her parents' household, raised in a surprisingly informal and affectionate environment for a royal of that era. Vicky, rejecting the stiff Prussian model of parenting which involved handing children over to tutors and governesses, oversaw her children's education personally, ensuring they were fluent in both German and English, well-read, and encouraged to develop their talents in music and art. Moretta's childhood was filled with summers at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight with her grandmother, Queen Victoria, and a constant stream of visiting English relatives. These trips were a breath of fresh air, an escape from the suffocating formality of Potsdam. In England, she could run on the beach, go for long walks without a phalanx of attendants, and enjoy the boisterous, informal company of her many cousins. She was being raised not as a rigid Prussian princess, but as a cosmopolitan European, taught to value love, compassion, and personal happiness as much as dynastic duty. Her mother filled her head with the romantic poetry of Tennyson and the novels of George Eliot, stories where love and personal integrity triumphed over circumstance. This upbringing, however, was preparing her for a world her parents dreamed of, not the one that actually existed, and this disconnect would prove to be her undoing. She was being taught to listen to her heart in a world that demanded she listen only to the state. The great catastrophe of her youth arrived, as it so often does, in the guise of a fairy tale. In 1881, when she was just 15, Viktoria met and fell head over heels in love with Prince Alexander of Battenberg. Sandro, as he was universally known, was a man seemingly plucked from the pages of a romantic novel. He was strikingly handsome, utterly charming, and possessed an aura of heroic glamour. Though his family was a morganatic branch of the House of Hesse and thus considered of a somewhat inferior rank in the strict hierarchy of German royalty, Sandro had carved out an extraordinary destiny for himself. At the tender age of 22, he had been elected as the first reigning prince of the newly independent Bulgaria, a nation that had just thrown off centuries of Ottoman rule. He was a sovereign ruler, a soldier who had distinguished himself in the Russo-Turkish War, and a man of immense personal courage. The attraction between the young princess and the Balkan prince was immediate, powerful, and mutual. They met at a family gathering, and for Viktoria, who had been raised on romantic English literature, Sandro was a real-life hero. He spoke not of court gossip, but of building a nation, of drafting a constitution, of leading men in battle. He listened to her with a rapt attention that she had never experienced from the stiff young Prussian officers she was usually expected to entertain. For Sandro, the charming and vivacious Moretta was a beacon of warmth and grace, a stark contrast to the brutal, cynical world of Balkan politics he inhabited. Their courtship flourished in the stolen moments of royal life, a shared dance that lasted a little too long, a quiet conversation in a palace conservatory, a series of increasingly passionate letters. With the enthusiastic approval of Viktoria's parents, they became secretly engaged. The crown prince and princess were ecstatic. They saw the match as ideal. Sandro's liberal political leanings and his connection to the British royal family, his brother Louis was married to one of Queen Victoria's granddaughters and would later become First Sea Lord of the British Admiralty, made him a perfect ideological ally. A marriage between him and Moretta would not only secure their daughter's happiness, but also strengthen the liberal bloc within the extended European royal family. It seemed that for once a marriage of love and a marriage of strategic benefit could be one and the same. They had catastrophically misjudged the political landscape. The news of the proposed match, when it inevitably leaked, sent shockwaves through the Chancellery in Berlin and the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The Russian Tsar, Alexander III, viewed Bulgaria as a client state, a Slavic little brother that should be firmly under Russian control. He saw the independent-minded, Western-leaning Sandro as a dangerous upstart and an obstacle to Russian ambitions in the Balkans. The idea of Sandro strengthening his position by marrying into the heart of both the German and British imperial families was utterly intolerable to him. The Tsar made his displeasure known in the strongest possible terms, threatening to abrogate key treaties with Germany if the marriage went ahead. This was all the ammunition Otto von Bismarck needed. The Iron Chancellor's foreign policy rested on a complex and fragile web of alliances, the cornerstone of which was maintaining good relations with the autocratic Russian Empire to avoid a two-front war. The last thing he wanted was to provoke the Tsar over what he considered to be the romantic whims of a teenage princess. He viewed the proposed marriage as a direct threat to the stability of the Reich, an act of amateurish meddling by the crown princess that jeopardized his entire grand strategy. He brought the full weight of his immense political power to bear against it. He declared to the emperor that the match was a political impossibility, a matter of national security. What followed was a brutal and heartbreaking family war. Crown Princess Vicky, a woman who had never shied away from a fight with Bismarck, launched a desperate, impassioned campaign to save her daughter's engagement. She wrote frantic, lengthy letters to her mother, Queen Victoria, pleading for her to intervene. "The happiness of my poor child is at stake," she wrote, "and the cruelty and injustice of Bismarck are beyond words." Queen Victoria, a true romantic at heart and fond of both Moretta and Sandro, was firmly on their side. She wrote to her granddaughter, I am so fond of Sandro, and he has behaved so well and been so shamefully treated. She lobbied the German court, arguing that politics should not be allowed to destroy two young lives. The Crown Prince, Fritz, also fought for his daughter's happiness, confronting both his father and the Chancellor in a series of tense, angry meetings. He argued that his daughter's personal happiness was paramount, a sentiment that was utterly alien to the old Prussian court. But their efforts were in vain. They were fighting against an immovable object. Bismarck cleverly framed the issue as a matter of loyalty to the emperor and the state, painting the crown princess as a meddling Englishwoman who was willing to endanger German foreign policy for her own selfish family ambitions. He enlisted Victoria's own brother, the young Prince Wilhelm, in his cause. Wilhelm, ever eager to curry favor with the Chancellor and resentful of his mother's influence, actively worked against his sister's engagement, arguing that it was un-Prussian and a betrayal of German interests. The elderly Emperor Wilhelm I, a man who had always been wary of his daughter-in-law's influence and who revered Bismarck as the architect of his empire, ultimately sided with his chancellor. The final crushing blow came directly from him. The emperor summoned Viktoria and her parents and formally forbade the marriage. The command was absolute and not open to appeal. To defy it would have been an act of treason. For Viktoria, the decision was a psychological cataclysm. At 16, she was forced to write a letter to the man she loved, a stilted, formal missive dictated by others, ending their engagement and their dream of a future together. The vibrant, joyful girl was shattered. A deep, inconsolable grief took hold of her. She retreated from the world, refusing to participate in court life. Most alarmingly, she stopped eating, developing a severe case of anorexia that caused her parents to fear for her life. She would spend hours staring into space, a ghost haunting the corridors of the palace that had once been her sanctuary. The light that had once defined her personality was extinguished. The fairy tale had been systematically dismantled by the cold machinery of the state. Sandro, himself heartbroken and politically isolated, was eventually forced to abdicate his Bulgarian throne in 1886 after being kidnapped in a Russian-backed coup. He later found a measure of happiness in a private, morganatic marriage to an opera singer, but Viktoria was not so fortunate. The ghost of her first love would haunt her for the rest of her days, a constant, painful reminder of the happiness that had been stolen from her, leaving a void in her heart that she would one day try to fill with the most disastrous of consequences. The aftermath of the Sandro affair plunged Viktoria's life into a prolonged gray limbo. While her younger sisters, Sophie and Margaret, went on to make successful dynastic marriages to the future King of Greece and the Landgrave of Hesse, respectively, Viktoria remained at home, a spectral presence at the German court. She was the unmarried princess, a living symbol of a political battle her parents had lost. The years ticked by, and with each passing season the hope of a suitable match dwindled. She was seen as damaged goods, the center of a political firestorm that no foreign court wished to import. Potential suitors were quietly warned off by Bismarck's agents. She was trapped, a princess in a tower built not of stone, but of political expediency. The personal and political landscape shifted seismically in 1888, the so-called Year of the Three Emperors. In March, her grandfather Wilhelm I died at the age of 90. Her beloved father Fritz finally ascended the throne as Emperor Friedrich III. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed that the liberal dream might yet be realized. The air in the palace was electric with possibility. Plans were drawn up for a new constitution, for social reforms, for a government that would be accountable to the people. But it was a false dawn. Fritz was already dying of throat cancer, a fact that had been cruelly concealed from him by his doctors at Bismarck's behest. He was a voiceless emperor, communicating only through written notes, his reign a desperate race against time. His death in June of that year, after a mere 99 days on the throne, was not just a personal tragedy for Viktoria. It was the death of a more hopeful vision for Germany. Her difficult, arrogant, and deeply reactionary elder brother, Wilhelm II, became Kaiser. The man who had once written to Bismarck that there was only one master in the Reich, and that is I, was now in charge. The court, already a cold place, became positively glacial for those who did not share the new Kaiser's bombastic worldview. Wilhelm held a deep-seated resentment for his English mother, and by extension, for the liberal values she had instilled in his sisters. For Viktoria, the situation was now critical. She was 24 years old, and in the rigid calculus of 19th century royalty, she was perilously close to being considered a spinster. The pressure on her, from both her mother and her brother, to finally accept a husband, any suitable husband, became intense. Wilhelm, in particular, wanted his embarrassing unmarried sister settled and out of sight. The grand prospects of her youth were long gone. The man who was eventually found for her was Prince Adolf of Schaumburg-Lippe. He was a younger son from a minor, though sovereign German princely house. He was a respectable military officer, a man of impeccable duty, and by all accounts a thoroughly decent but profoundly uninspiring individual. He was quiet, reserved, and his main interests were hunting and the minutiae of military protocol. He was, in short, a safe, practical, and entirely passionless choice. There was no courtship, no romance, no pretense that this was a love match. It was a transaction, arranged to solve the problem of an unmarried princess. Viktoria, exhausted by years of grief and facing a future of lonely obsolescence under her brother's hostile reign, knew what was expected of her. She met Prince Adolf a handful of times in carefully chaperoned settings. There was no spark, no connection, only a shared understanding of their respective duties. In November 1890, she dutifully accepted his proposal. Their wedding was a grand affair, as befitted a Princess of Prussia, but it was a hollow spectacle. As she stood at the altar draped in Hohenzollern diamonds, Viktoria was not embracing a new life of joy. She was resigning herself to a life of quiet duty, exchanging the sharp pain of a lost love for the dull, chronic ache of an empty one. The couple took up residence in Bonn, in a neoclassical palace on the banks of the Rhine that they named the Palais Schaumburg. Life settled into a predictable, monotonous routine. Viktoria performed her role as Princess Adolf with flawless propriety. She became a patroness of local charities, opened bazaars, and hosted sedate dinner parties for university professors and local dignitaries. Prince Adolf pursued his military career, often away from home for long stretches. Theirs was a relationship built on courtesy and shared public duties, not intimacy. They were two lonely people sharing a very large, very quiet house. Contemporary accounts and later letters reveal a life of immense, stultifying boredom, a world away from the intellectual and artistic vibrancy of her parents' home. She filled her days with long, solitary walks, endless letter writing, and managing the vast household, activities that provided structure but no fulfillment. The deepest sadness of their union, and the one that sealed its sense of failure, was their childlessness. Not long after their marriage, Viktoria became pregnant, a moment of profound hope that a new chapter of her life might finally begin. But she suffered a miscarriage in the early weeks. It was a devastating blow, not just emotionally, but dynastically. Medically, it was discovered that she was unable to conceive again. In an era when the single most important function of a royal wife was the production of an heir, this inability was seen as a profound personal and dynastic failure. The absence of children's laughter in the cavernous rooms of the Palais Schaumburg was a constant silent reproach, a daily reminder that her life had not followed the expected course. For Viktoria, who had been raised in a large and affectionate family, the dream of having a loving home of her own, a sanctuary like the one her parents had created, died with that first and only pregnancy. She sought refuge where she could. She spent a great deal of time with her widowed mother, the Dowager Empress Frederick, at her nearby castle Friedrichshof. Vicky remained her daughter's closest confidant, the only person who truly understood the depth of the initial wound that had so blighted her life. But Vicky's own life was one of grief and political isolation, and she died of cancer in 1901, leaving Viktoria more alone than ever. Her relationship with her brother, the Kaiser, was formal and distant. He treated his unmarried and childless sister with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing her as one of the many disappointments in his family. He rarely visited, and when he did, his presence was overbearing and critical. Her relationships with her married sisters were a source of both comfort and pain. She adored her nieces and nephews, but visiting their bustling, happy family homes in Athens and Hesse was a poignant reminder of all that she had been denied. For 26 years, this was Viktoria's life, a long, slow, featureless expanse of time. She was a princess, yet she had no real power or influence. She was a wife, yet she had no real partnership or passion. She was a woman trapped in amber, perfectly preserved on the outside, but with no life or movement within. In 1914, the world that had defined and constrained her life exploded. The First World War was a personal agony for Viktoria. It pitted her German homeland against her English motherland, tearing her family loyalties in two. She was viewed with suspicion in Germany because of her English heritage, while her relatives in Britain, who had changed their family name from Battenberg to Mountbatten, saw her as part of the enemy regime. Then, in 1916, in the middle of the conflict, Prince Adolf died of wounds sustained on the Eastern Front. At the age of 50, Viktoria was a widow. The man who had been her quiet, dutiful companion for more than a quarter of a century was gone. Their marriage had been a kingdom of shadows, but it had at least provided a framework, a role, a reason for being. Now, even that was gone. She was adrift, a solitary woman in a grand, empty palace, as the cataclysm of war raged outside, poised to sweep away the very foundations of her world forever. The German defeat in November 1918 was not just a military surrender, it was the death of an entire world. The revolution that swept across the country in its final days consumed the monarchy. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Viktoria's brother, was forced to abdicate and flee into ignominious exile in the Netherlands. The Hohenzollern dynasty, which had ruled Prussia and Germany for 500 years, was relegated to the history books. In its place, the Weimar Republic was born, a chaotic, vibrant, and deeply troubled democracy. For Viktoria, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. She was stripped of her royal titles, her status, and most critically, the generous state income that came with them. While she was by no means destitute, she had inherited a substantial personal fortune from her mother, who in turn had been left wealthy by her mother, Queen Victoria. The central pillar of her identity had been kicked away. She was no longer Her Royal Highness Princess Viktoria of Prussia. She was simply Victoria, former princess, a citizen of a republic that viewed her and her kind with suspicion and resentment. For the next decade, she lived in a strange, suspended state of social and emotional isolation. She remained at the Palais Schaumburg in Bonn, a relic of a vanquished regime. The post-war years in Germany were a time of chaotic social upheaval, political violence, and hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of millions. Victoria's world had shrunk to the manicured grounds of her estate. She was 60 years old, a lonely widow with no children and few close friends, rattling around a palace that was a monument to a life unlived. The vivacious spirit of Moretta had long since been buried under layers of disappointment and grief. She was a woman haunted by the ghosts of what might have been, the ghost of her beloved father, the ghost of her lost love, Sandro, the ghost of the children she never had. It was in this state of profound psychological weakness, of a deep and desperate loneliness, that she stumbled into the final defining catastrophe of her life. In 1927, into this hermetically sealed world of lonely routine walked Alexander Zubkov. He was a whirlwind of everything her life had lacked: youth, danger, exoticism, and raw, intoxicating charisma. Zubkov was a Russian immigrant who had washed up in Germany with the tide of refugees fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. His story was a tapestry of unverifiable claims. He was a nobleman, a former officer in the Tsar's army, a man who had lost vast estates and witnessed his family's murder. In reality, he was a dancer of dubious talent, an opportunist and a consummate con artist who had been making a precarious living in the cabarets of Berlin. He was also just 27 years old, 35 years younger than the aging princess. He was handsome, penniless, and possessed a predator's instinct for weakness. When he was introduced to the lonely 61-year-old Viktoria by a mutual acquaintance, he did not see a woman. He saw a vault, and he knew he had just found the key. For Viktoria, Zubkov was a final desperate chance at redemption. After a lifetime of stifling duty, of loveless silence, of being defined by what she had been denied, he seemed to offer everything she had ever craved. He showered her with attention, flattery, and a performance of passionate devotion that she, in her starved emotional state, mistook for the real thing. He listened to her stories of the past, of her lost love, and mirrored her sense of victimhood, claiming they were two noble souls cast adrift by the cruel tides of history. He was not another stoic German prince. He was a romantic figure, a fellow victim. He was her Sandro, returned to her in a different guise. It was a pathetic, tragic delusion, but she clung to it with the ferocity of a drowning woman. She fell for him completely, utterly, and with a speed that horrified the few people still close to her. He proposed within weeks of their first meeting. She ignored the frantic warnings of her financial advisors, who saw him for the fraud he was. She dismissed the pleading of her friends, who begged her to see reason. She defied the scandalized commands of her exiled family. This time, she would not be denied. This time, no emperor, no chancellor would stand in the way of her heart. She was a wealthy, independent widow, and she would finally claim the happiness that had been stolen from her all those years ago. On November 19, 1927, in a chaotic and widely publicized civil ceremony in Bonn, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria and sister of the last German Kaiser became Mrs. Alexander Zubkov. The scandal was a supernova, exploding across the front pages of newspapers from Berlin to London to New York. It was a story almost too lurid to be believed. Kaiser's sister Ved's Russian dancer. Her family was apoplectic. From his exile in Dorn, Wilhelm II issued a furious decree, formally banishing his sister from the House of Hohenzollern. He forbade the rest of the family from having any contact with her whatsoever. In his eyes, she had not just made a fool of herself, she had disgraced their name, their history, their very blood. Victoria, who had already lost her country, and her status, was now officially disowned by her own family. She had burned every last bridge for this man. Zubkov wasted no time in revealing his true nature. The moment the marriage certificate was signed, the performance of the devoted lover ended, and the rapacious parasite emerged. He embarked on a spending spree of such epic, vulgar proportions that it beggared belief. Victoria's carefully managed fortune began to hemorrhage. He bought fleets of luxury cars, which he delighted in racing through the quiet streets of Bonn. He hosted decadent, champagne-fueled parties at the Palais Schaumburg that lasted for days, filled with his disreputable friends from the Berlin underworld. He showered expensive jewelry and furs on other women. He established a short-lived restaurant, a vanity project that burned through cash before closing in a matter of weeks. He treated Viktoria not as a wife, but as a bank teller, demanding ever larger sums of money which she, desperate to maintain the illusion of their romance and terrified of being alone again, continued to provide. Within a year, the vast Hohenzollern and British fortune was gone. Every last penny. All that remained was a mountain of debts so colossal that their creditors began to circle. Zubkov, having achieved his goal, began to openly mock his wife, calling her the old woman in front of guests and engaging in flagrant affairs. When the money finally ran out for good, the situation reached its nadir. Viktoria was declared bankrupt. To satisfy the legions of creditors, she was forced to agree to the ultimate, soul-destroying humiliation, a public auction of every single item within the Palais Schaumburg. In the autumn of 1928, the event took place. It was a media circus. Reporters and morbidly curious members of the public descended on Bonn to witness the spectacle of a royal life being picked apart and sold off, piece by painful piece. They trampled through her private rooms, fingering the furniture she had inherited from her mother, leafing through her books, bidding on her silverware. Every item from grand state portraits of her imperial ancestors to the most intimate items of her wardrobe was held up, given a lot number, and sold to the highest bidder. A set of delicate watercolors painted by her mother, the Empress Frederick, was sold for a pittance. A silver-framed photograph of her father went to a curiosity seeker. It was a public vivisection of a life, a brutal and final stripping away of her privacy and her dignity. She was losing not just her possessions, but the last tangible links to her parents, her grandmother, and the world that had abandoned her. The auction, chaotic as it was, did not raise enough to cover the debts. By this time, Zubkov had vanished, having fled the country to escape prosecution for fraud, leaving Viktoria to face the consequences alone. The creditors seized the palace itself. The Princess of Prussia, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was evicted from her home. Bankrupt, abandoned, and disowned, she stepped out of the gates of the Palais Schaumburg for the last time, with nowhere to go. The abyss she had been skirting for decades had finally swallowed her whole. The final year of Princess Victoria's life was a descent into a kind of poverty and isolation that would have been unimaginable to the young girl who once played in the gilded halls of Potsdam. Having lost her palace and every possession of value, she was forced to find lodging in a small furnished room in a modest boarding house in a suburb of Bonn. The sheer scale of her fall is difficult to comprehend. This was a woman who had been raised to believe in her own semi-divine status, waited on hand and foot since birth, her life governed by the rigid protocol of the most powerful court in Europe. Now she was a lonely old woman struggling to pay her rent and buy food, relying on the kindness of her landlady. Her health, which had been fragile since the eating disorders of her youth, began to collapse under the immense weight of stress, malnutrition, and shame. She was a pariah. Her family, adhering to the Kaiser's decree, remained silent and distant. The man who had caused her ruin, Alexander Zubkov, was a ghost. Reports surfaced that he was working as a waiter in Luxembourg, having briefly been jailed for fraud. He expressed no remorse and made no attempt to contact the woman he had so ruthlessly destroyed. She was utterly, profoundly alone, left with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. A few loyal friends from her former life, horrified by her plight, provided what small financial assistance they could, but Victoria's ingrained royal pride made it difficult for her to accept what she saw as charity. She would often refuse meals, too ashamed to admit she could not pay for them. In the cold, damp autumn of 1929, she contracted a severe case of pneumonia. There was no money for private doctors or comfortable clinics. She was admitted to the St. Francis Public Hospital in Bonn. As she lay in the anonymous ward, surrounded by strangers, her life ebbed away, not with a grand operatic finale, but with a quiet, lonely fade. On November 13th, 1929, Princess Viktoria died. She was 63 years old. Her funeral was a small, sparsely attended affair, a sad and quiet postscript to a life that had begun with such magnificent promise. She was buried in the grounds of Schloss Friedrichshof, her mother's home, a final return to the only real sanctuary she had ever known. Princess Victoria's life also serves as a stark and uncomfortable mirror to the very nature of royalty. We are taught to see these figures as symbols of stability and duty. Victoria's story rips away that veil. It shows us a real, fragile, and deeply flawed human being, trapped in a role that allowed for no emotional deviation. The same system that bestowed upon her immense privilege also enforced upon her a rigid set of expectations that ultimately broke her spirit. The vivacious, loving girl her parents had raised was an anomaly, a type of personality that the cold, cynical world of Bismarck's Germany could not accommodate. She was punished for having a heart, and that punishment defined the rest of her existence. She was a woman born into the wrong family, in the wrong country, at the wrong time. In the end, the life of Princess Viktoria is an unfinished symphony. The beautiful, hopeful melody of her youth was brutally interrupted, replaced by a long, melancholic passage of silence and restraint. The final movement was a chaotic, jarring cacophony, a desperate attempt to recapture the original theme that only resulted in total discord. To look at her life is to understand that a person's significance cannot always be measured in achievements or successes, but sometimes in the sheer scale of their suffering and the depth of their endurance. She was a woman who was denied a throne of love, and in her misguided attempt to build one for herself, she brought the entire edifice of her life crashing down upon her head. She is a ghost in the grand saga of European royalty, a beautiful, sad, and cautionary melody that reminds us that behind every fairy tale castle, there can be a very lonely room and a heart that is quietly, relentlessly breaking.